This is Mark McNeese, and you're listening to One Thing or Another, interviews and conversations. Welcome to the One Thing or Another podcast. This is your host, Mark. My guest today is author John Morgan Wilson, out in Los Angeles. John's an American journalist and author of crime fiction, notably the Benjamin Justice mystery novels. The books feature a reclusive ex-reporter, ruined by a Pulitzer scandal and haunted by personal loss, who operates out of West Hollywood, becoming enmeshed in murder investigations in and around L.A. Simple Justice was the first book in the series. It came out in 1996 and won the Mystery Writers of America Edgar Award for Best First Novel. In addition to that, 6 of the 8 books in the Justice series were nominated for Lambda Literary Awards for Best Gay Men's Mystery, and 3 of them won in that category. John, how are you today?
I'm good, Mark. It's nice to talk to you. We're a little smoky here from the fires. Not close to us, but close enough that smoke is filtered in all the way to the ocean.
And I had asked you a little while ago, before recording, it's 12 months out of the year. It's what I'm seeing that's the fire season now in California. And is that true?
Yes, it's wildfire season year-round out here. I've got a number of really close friends up in Northern California who live in the foothills and the mountains, and they live with the threat all year round. And 2 of my closest friends have been evacuated the last few days. They just got home to find their places safe, but a lot of the homes around them are gone. And the cover story on the LA Times yesterday morning was a big headline, California's Climate Apocalypse, with horrific photographs of some of the damage up there. And basically the story is this is the new normal. And 3 million acres have already burned this year. And during the terrible fires a couple of years ago, that was 2 million for the year. So we're at 3 million, and the season for the worst part of the season for fires is just starting. So it's a terrible new era we're living in that regard, and global warming is a real reality here.
I'm sure, I know it is. And my sister lives in Ojai, which is about an hour north of L.A. And 2 years ago, I remember she had to evacuate that little mountain town and ended up in a motel with 5 dogs for almost a week because she couldn't get back into her home. But it was safe. Her home survived, but it was terrible. And I had expected to see a lot of burned landscape when we visited last year. A lot of it was starting to recover in Ventura, but I can't imagine if I lived there, especially if you're near a fire zone, you're near some place that could be consumed. Do you consider leaving California? What do you do? You know? Yeah,
well, we're not in a fire danger area because I'm in West Hollywood, which is an urban landscape halfway between downtown LA and the ocean, and so wildfire really isn't an immediate threat to us. But up where your sister lives in Ohio, that's definitely fire area. Santa Barbara, Ventura, that whole area has been devastated a number of times. And so that's not really a factor for us right now.
Now, I lived in Los Angeles from 1981 to 93. I lived in Hollywood on Franklin Avenue. And I remember West Hollywood, of course I do. I just saw a documentary a few weeks ago about Circus of Books. And I remember it was a / gay bookstore. I don't know what you want to call it, but it was there by the gay bars over on Santa Monica Boulevard. And I wanted to ask you, because you've been there a long time, before we talk about your books, has West Hollywood changed a lot from your observation in, say, the last 30 years?
I get asked that question a lot, and it is changing fast. Circus of Books, as you mentioned, is closed. It's down there about 10 blocks east of us along Santa Monica Boulevard, and right across from the legendary Gold Coast Bar, which is a venerable old bar there. And that neighborhood hasn't changed dramatically, except that it's livelier, more restaurants, that kind of thing. But as you moved west into the western end of West Hollywood, where we live, There's a lot of development going on, and I was just asked this question by someone else who interviewed me for the Lambda Literary Review, my neighbor Stephen Rames, and we were talking about it because we deal with it all the time. There's an enormous influx of visitors on weekends, and there's so many clubs now, so many restaurants, so many bars. It's literally thousands and thousands of people on the weekends, and during the warmer months, even some of the weeknights. And with that comes what you might expect, a rise in crime, fights, vomit, just trouble, tension, noise. And so it's changed the quality of life here. Now, some would say for the better. If you're young and that's your life, it's a lot of fun. But for an older resident like me who owns a home, it sometimes becomes a little overwhelming. It kind of filters over into your house and your home, and we've had to chase people out of the yard numerous times, and the other factor is development. Lots of places rising up, big buildings. I can look out my window right here up towards Sunset Boulevard and see a huge tower, maybe 15 or 20 stories tall, that wasn't there 2 or 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And development has really taken over. West Hollywood's a real happening place. It's in the news all the time, and it's a real destination, and so it's changed quite a bit in that regard.
It made me think about my husband Frank and I. I lived in New York. I moved from LA to New York. I lived in New York City for 25 years, and I was there for the last, I guess, 11 with Frank. But we sold our apartment. We live in we're in the country in rural New Jersey, but we're 15 minutes from New Hope, Pennsylvania, which is a very artistic happening town in Lambertville, and so I can identify with getting a little bit older and not wanting to be around all the action anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of walk through it and past it now when I go to the gym. When the gym was open, the gym's 6 blocks from my house. The nice thing about living in West Hollywood is you can walk everywhere. And we know a lot of our neighbors. There was a point when we knew almost all our immediate neighbors, but a lot have moved on or passed on. And we still have some real close friends in the neighborhood here, and that's one of the really nice things about living in West Hollywood. And the town, in terms of social issues and politics, city government is still real forward-looking and progressive, and has great social services for its residents. And, of course, that's supported by all the retail. So it's a double-edged sword. You got to live with the retail and the influx of visitors and the nightlife and so forth, and it supports some very good things in town. So we're still here, and there's things we value highly about West Hollywood. It's just harder and harder to take some of the trouble that comes along with it.
Yeah, I'm sure. Now, I want to segue into your books, specifically Simple Justice. You had a career in journalism. I don't know if you still do any of that, but how did you go from that to writing your first novel, your first mystery?
Well, when I was about to turn 50, I had been in journalism. I started writing newspapers when I was 19, and when I was a college dropout, and just by chance started writing for my local newspaper, which was a fairly big paper, actually. It was the Daily Breeze, a Copley paper down here on the south of Los Angeles, one of the beach cities, and 50,000 circulation. So it wasn't a tiny paper, but I just started covering sports for them as a stringer, and I really got hooked right away. I had never had any ambitions to be a writer before then. It wasn't even in my head, and I just loved it, and I went back to school, got a journalism degree, and was writing for newspapers along the way. That's how I paid most of my way through college, and started writing for magazines when I was in college. And my goal became to freelance, and I've been able to freelance most of my life. first newspapers and magazines. Later, I went into television news. That was a staff job briefly, but then I segued into freelancing for documentary and fact-based stuff in television. So I had a long career as a journalist and a fact-based writer. But when I was turning 50, that was a point when I had just gone into TV, and I didn't want to go back to print writing full-time, newspaper and magazine work, but I knew that television wasn't really satisfying in a creative way to me. And I just decided to write a mystery novel. A friend gave me a copy of Walter Mosley's Devil in a Blue Dress and said, "You've got to read this book." And I said, I really don't read mysteries much anymore. I loved them as a kid and as a young man, but I'd stopped reading mysteries many, many years before. And I read a lot of fiction, but it was mostly literary fiction. And I found a lot of mystery writing very formulaic and repetitive and conventional. I just lost interest in it. But then I read Devil in a Blue Dress, and it just kind of opened my eyes to what you could do with mystery fiction. And the way he crossed social issues and racial history and the issue of racism and the history of Los Angeles in that regard from a black man's point of view after the war. And yet the writing was so terrific, and the story was good, and everything about it I loved. And I thought, I wonder if I could write a mystery novel expressing some of the things I want to express and some of the story material I want to deal with. And I decided to write Simple Justice, carved out some time. I was writing for a TV show that lasted 5.5 months on hiatus. I wrote Simple Justice, but I kind of told myself this has got to be a different kind of writing, a deeper, more personal, honest kind of writing than I've ever done before, because you're not getting any younger, and you've got to decide to really what do you want to write, and what are you going to put into it? How deep are you willing to dig? And that was how Simple Justice came about.
And what was the inspiration for the character's name?
He might have, I can't remember real clearly, it's been a long time, but he might have been named after I started writing. It's possible I picked the name first. I did work from an outline, but what happened was fascinating to me. I had written some short fiction in college that I'd never sold, but it had really whet my appetite for short fiction, and I'd read a lot of short fiction throughout life, and it was my favorite reading in high school was literary short fiction. And when I sat down to write, I thought, well, I'm going to write the best mystery I can, but I want to keep it fairly light and entertaining and be able to sell it. But when I started writing in the first person, and I never chose to write in the first person. I just sat down and started writing. I'd never written in the first person before. And this voice of this lead character just took over from the first line. And I just couldn't stop writing. I wrote the book in 6 weeks, the first draft in 6 weeks, beginning to end. It was like sitting down therapy every day. And I couldn't wait to get up in the morning to write. I was writing 15 hours a day and just absolutely in a thrall as I wrote, all in, as one says. And this voice took over in the first person, and it was Benjamin Justice, and that became his name, and the whole tone of the book changed. It became much darker. There was more in it about the AIDS epidemic and the aftermath of the AIDS epidemic, and which I went through. I lost a partner during those years, and lost so many friends, almost all my gay friends, but one or two. And that worked itself into the story, and it just became a much darker, more personal, and for me, a more honest and authentic book than I ever anticipated writing. And that was the story of Simple Justice. And then I went away backpacking with my buddies for, probably 6 weeks. Some with buddies and some out on my own. That was the way I used to spend my summers, go out with my friends for a while and then go solo out into the Sierra. And when I came back, I sat down and immediately trimmed the last 5 chapters and started doing heavy rewriting from there.
Well, I'm curious now that you said that you wrote it in a short period of time like that, in many, many hours a day. Did you outline, or did you write and not know where you were going until you got there?
No, I excuse me, I'm going to have to cough. I did work from an outline because as a journalist, whenever I had written big stories, long stories or multi-part series for a newspaper, I had always outlined because I needed to be able to organize my material to some extent, or I would just get lost in it. And I always, as a freelance, you got to be able to write fast, or you don't make a living at it. And I was a very, very fast writer, but I would work with an outline on the bigger stories. The short stories I wouldn't. The shorter pieces, the shorter features, I wouldn't bother with an outline. But I knew that I needed an outline for the Benjamin Justice novel, Simple Justice, the first one, because it had a lot of characters in it, a lot of suspects, a winding, complex tale, and I just worried that I would paint myself into too many corners and go on writing, trying to fix so many things. So I did work for an outline, but as I worked, characters showed themselves to me, appeared in the story out of the impetus and the momentum in the story, and different subplots. And it took. I think if you work with an outline, you'd better be real flexible with it. What I would call a creative outline. It might guide you to some extent structurally, but if you are absolutely rigid, your writing probably isn't going to have much life to it. Mm-hmm. So you have to be flexible with it, and that's what I was, and out of that came the book, and that's why so much rewriting was needed when I came back. I really needed to clean it up, in fact, and then for this new revised edition, it wasn't supposed to be revised when ReQueered Tales, which is the company that wanted to republish my 8 books when they went out of print, they were ready to reprint the books just as they were, but when I sat down after 25 years of not reading the first one and started reading it, I frankly was kind of appalled by a lot of the writing, and I found some plot inconsistencies and some factual errors, things that didn't make sense, and I told the publisher I really am going to need some time. I'm going to completely rework this book from page 1 till the end until I'm happy with it. And so that's what happened, and that's why the new revision on the 25th anniversary of the book.
Did you expect it to have the success that it did? You won the Edgar Award. That's really nice.
Well, none of the books were ever big bestsellers, but the book got me a 4-book deal with Doubleday for pretty nice advances, especially for a gay mystery writer. The advances were solid, low 5 figures, but solid advances that certainly more than covered my time writing, and in terms of monetarily. And it was a 4-book deal. It was Doubleday, a major publisher, and then it did win the Edgar. So I suppose it's a success in terms of to that extent, but I don't want to pretend it was selling millions of copies. It wasn't in Michael Connelly territory.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite writers, by the way.
Yeah, Michael or Lee?
Michael Connelly.
Michael, when I worked at the LA Times, I freelanced. That became my home base as a freelancer. I freelanced for many, many big newspapers and magazines, but I settled in with the LA Times during its golden years when it used so much freelance material, and I had hundreds and hundreds of bylines there over a 15 or 20 year period, and eventually they asked me to go on staff as an editor, so I went on staff as a part-time editor but kept my freelance status because I wanted the flexibility to write on anything I wanted to. And if you go on staff full-time, you have restrictions on writing outside the newspaper, and they want you generally on a beat, covering a certain beat. anyway, I wanted to keep my freedom and my flexibility. And Michael was there at the time making his mark, as although he'd been on a short list for the Pulitzer when he was working in Florida as a crime reporter. He was at the Times then. I never met him. I never knew him. I knew he was there. And it wasn't until I won the Edgar, I got a note from him. It was very sweet. It was a note congratulating me on the Edgar. He had won the same Edgar for Best First a few years before. With I want to say Black Echo. I hope I'm getting the title of his first
believe that's
book right.
Correct. I think so.
Terrific book. Anyway, he sent me a nice note congratulating me on the Edgar and warning me. He said, "Give yourself more time on the second book. It's liable to be more difficult than the first one." And he was right. The second book was much harder to write. And I'm in fact about to sit down to start revising that one. And I welcome I'm grateful for the opportunity to try to improve it, but I kind of dread what I'm going to be reading because I remember how tough it was to write, and I was never really happy with it.
Now, if ReQueered is doing the eight books, does that mean you're going to revise all 8 books?
That is my goal if I live to the end, if it doesn't kill me, because there's a big difference between writing hard and fast and long hours when you're 50 and when you're 75. And I just don't have that same mental and physical stamina. Nonetheless, I do plan to, yes, look over every book and start rewriting as if it's a first draft or an early draft to see if I can improve things as I write. I think that there's probably going to be less to rewrite as I go because hopefully you learn a lot writing your first novel, and you get better from there. What was lacking for me in the second book was the emotional impact and the emotional involvement I had in the first book. It's as if I emptied myself in that first book and faced the blank page with the second book and felt I'd used up a lot. I say that, but I also want to say if there's any writers or aspiring writers out there, don't hold back on your first book. Don't think, I'm going to leave this out, take this out, save it for my second book. The first book you write has to be the best book you can write. It has to be the book you're born to write, I think. Or it's not going to be the best book you can write, and it's liable not to be published, not to do well, not to get noticed. Put everything you can into that first book. I don't mean throw things in that don't belong. I mean just pour your heart and soul into it. And then, of course, craft is the other part of the equation that's so important. And eventually things will reproduce as you write your other books. You'll find a way to get them written and find your rhythm again. But don't hold back on your first book. Had I held back on my first book and not written Simple Justice with the intensity and involvement and engagement that I did, it certainly would never have come alive as a novel. It's far from perfect, but I think that it's got something in it that it did well to the extent that it did. It did win at least one prize and it got the series rolling. I think that I was talking with a friend, a very astute friend, who's a very experienced editor and writer, and I was talking about my problems with the plot on the first book as I was rewriting, and he said people didn't love that book for the plot. They loved it for the character, the main character of Benjamin Justice, because he was so unusual, so different, so troubled, and yet somehow always fighting for the right thing in the end, and it was the character really that carried that book, I think. And I mean, I welcome your opinion on that.
I'll give it to you. I ordered it. I pre-ordered it. It's not out, right? I'm correct, right?
It is out tomorrow on September 15th.
Yes, that's what I was saying. Because in our
and if you order it paperback, it's probably going to be held up a bit because of the pandemic. All of book publishing is suffering from book orders moving their way behind because of so many people having to work at home or being unable to work. And I just read something recently, I think it was Publishers Weekly, on this subject. So, but it's available as an ebook, and those come pretty fast.
That's what I pre-ordered, and I'm because I like to support. I'm an author myself, and I like to support authors. So, I will order a book before I would ask for like a PDF or something like that.
And I appreciate that, and I hope my publisher offered you a book, but I said you wanted to order it because that's your habit to support authors by buying their book.
My standard.
Well, thank you.
I just have a couple more questions. I do want to mention, by the way, that I was also in the news business. I was not a journalist. I was the assistant to the global managing editor at Reuters. And I loved the newsroom environment. It was the best job I ever had. I was there for 11 years in New York City. I was there. I had only been there for like a couple of weeks when 9/11 happened, and we were in the newsroom watching the towers on fire. I called my boss. I had a different boss at the time. He was in London, and I called him and I said, "David, turn the news on. A small plane hit the World Trade Center." That's what we thought had happened. Because initially we didn't know. We didn't know it was airliners. We thought it was like some wayward pilot had just really screwed up. But I'm just bringing it up because I loved that environment. I loved journalism, and I can't. It's been so dispiriting for me to live in a time where half of our country, if not half the globe, uses the term fake news. I knew people who dedicated their lives to journalism, and good journalism. I hate what we're going through right now, and I just wanted to mention that because you talked about being at the LA Times, and there's something very invigorating about that environment.
Well, the justice books are set in the world for your readers, or for your listeners who don't know the justice books or the character. He is you mentioned at the top of the show, I think. He's an ex-reporter who's been ruined by a Pulitzer scandal of his own making, and he's lost that world that he loves so much, that he thrived in, where he really found himself and his identity. And but he's able to go back into that world because of some happenstance in the book. And he's never going to really be a part of it again because this scandal hangs over his head, and yet he gets a chance to put a foot back in, and he works with a younger reporter, Alexander Templeton, a black reporter who's really promising and really smart, and they end up working together to investigate a murder outside a gay bar in Silver Lake, and with racial overtones, and that becomes the investigation that brings him back into the journalism world. And the justice novel, Simple Justice in particular, is replete with that journalism world. And one of the things I did in my revisions was I was able to kind of amplify that world and write a love letter to journalism, because when I wrote the book in 1995, it came out in 96, journalism was certainly struggling because the internet was just coming into our lives, but television had already made tremendous inroads in print journalism, and print journalism was beginning to struggle, even at the mighty LA Times, which was one of the most financially successful newspapers in the country. I mean, one of the 2 or 3 most financially successful, but they were starting to hurt. Television was hurting newspapers, and the internet was on its way. And so now, looking back, I was able in my revisions to write from that perspective of newspapers under threat, but nowhere near the way they're threatened now, not only financially, and of course now with the pandemic, but by a president that vilifies the press and other forces that vilify the press. And so you really get a taste of what journalism was like back then. And I loved, when I worked at the LA Times, first when I started freelancing, I would just hang out there. They finally gave me a press pass because I came to the office all the time. I love just walking down the hallways and running into legendary reporters and editors and using the library. And I was thrilled. It's a 10-story building, full city square, city block. It was a city of information, just thriving with people who wanted to bring true information and facts and investigate important stories and bring that to the world and bring that to their readers. That building is no longer a newspaper building. The Times has a new building out in El Segundo now, a much smaller building, and that building is going to be developed in some other way, that legendary building at First and Spring, downtown L.A. So you get a lot of that in the Justice series, and really the story ultimately is a story of a man seeking redemption, not just for the Pulitzer scandal that destroyed his career, but for a lot of things in his life. And it all hinges on solving this murder and getting information to the public on deadline. And that's what the whole story is pointed toward, as Alexander Templeton and Benjamin Justice work together to work through his demons so that he can help her solve this mystery that's at the heart of the story.
Well, I'm really excited to read it now. I can't wait because I like the fact that you said it's dark, so that's right up my alley. I think it's going to be a wonderful read, and I may have found a new series. I'm sure I did. I've one last question here on ReQueered Tales. I'm curious because I know Matt Loversmore. He's one of the people, one of the founders of that, and I'm going to be talking to him shortly. And they asked me to write a foreword for another reissue they're doing. How did they find you?
Well, this is such an interesting story about how ReQueered Tales found me and how I found them. And it's really been an important milestone in my life. They came along at just the right time, and the way it happened was John Michelson, who I believe are you having him on as a guest soon?
No, but I know John. I did the banner for the Facebook group. There
you go. Okay,
yeah.
Well, you were in the Facebook group. Okay, you gave something away there. But so you know what happened, kind of. But John had asked me, he's an author in Atlanta with his own series.
Yeah.
He had asked me to do an interview for his blog site, and we did the interview, and in the course of it, he learned that my Justice books were going out of print, the last of the 8. And I really didn't have plans to do anything with them. I was writing short fiction and still writing an occasional op-ed piece, journalistic piece once in a while. And I was happy doing that. I was happy with the lower profile. And John and other members of your group, Matt among them, and Justine Adamek, and who am I leaving? Alexander Inglis, some others. But it started with John, and he got some people together, and you apparently, and maybe you were in on this, started talking about how they could help save my series and help me by giving me assistance in certain areas I wasn't good at and wasn't willing to take on, business and so forth. And the aim at first was self-publication, which I really wasn't keen on doing. I didn't want to get too involved in that because I know what the challenges are in self-publishing, and I'm not a business guy and a marketing guy. I'm a writer. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that group that started out thinking they were going to help me self-publish my 8 Benjamin Justice mysteries, then started thinking about a nonprofit, but then that evolved into a full-fledged traditional royalty-paying publisher, ReQueered Tales, that's dedicated to rescuing what they think of as LGBTQ classics and bringing those back into print and preserving them. And it's just a wonderful thing they've done, and they've got more than 30 titles out in the past 2 years, with 40 more planned for next year. And they're doing wonderful things. And when I do publicity for my own book, I try to tell their story as much as I tell my own, because I think really that's the bigger, more important story. I'm just one author with these 8 books, but they're rescuing titles going back decades. They're doing post-Stonewall literature, but they're bringing many titles back that deserve to be saved. Many written by authors who died of AIDS, whose promising careers and even acclaimed careers were cut short by AIDS. So let's hear it for ReQueered Tales and the group of people behind it. And it all started with John Michelson.
Well, he'll be happy to hear you say that. And I have just been delighted talking to you today, John. I want to thank you for taking the time. I honestly am excited about reading your book once it arrives on my Kindle. And is there anything you want to say in wrapping up?
No, just all of you out there who want to be writers, just keep reading, keep writing, and it gives you something to do during the pandemic. And so no more excuses if you're not getting to it. But it's just a wonderful field if you love to write, and especially it helps if you don't mind rewriting, because that's where the books are finally made that are going to get published, or in the revision stage when the craft is applied to the great stories you've already put down on paper about making them better. And thanks for having me on. Good luck with your own writing, Mark. And to all the readers out there, if you can, buy your books through independent bookstores, even if you buy them online through independent bookstores, because the independents are dying fast, and they're a big part of gay writing, because they're the bookstores that were selling our first books when the major bookstores weren't carrying our titles. So I hope you can do that if you can.
You remember A Different Light? I was going there when it was in Silver Lake back in the 80s.
Yeah, A Different Light. I had it just my biggest sales were always at A Different Light here in Silver Lake, and I used to live in Silver Lake myself, and they're gone now, and the other independents are fast disappearing. So that's where I spend my money.
Again, John, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to your book, and I hope everybody else checks it out, buys it, reads it, and I can't wait for the subsequent books in the series. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Mark, for having me on, and stay safe.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.